They had the money, they had the plan, they had the world's support, and they still failed. India spent $23 billion trying to steal China's crown as the world's factory, and ended up making China stronger. Here's the story they don't want you to know. March 2025. The Indian government did something almost no government ever does. It told the truth. After 4 years of bold announcements, billions in promised subsidies, and a relentless parade of corporate signing ceremonies, officials quietly admitted that their most ambitious industrial program in modern history had not just missed its targets, it had failed completely. The program was called the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, PLI for short. $23 billion, 14 industries, one singular goal: make India the next China. And here's what makes this story genuinely fascinating, and honestly deeply important for anyone who wants to understand how the global economy actually works. India didn't fail for lack of trying. It didn't fail because the world wasn't watching or wasn't supportive. It failed because ambition, no matter how loudly declared, cannot substitute for the kind of deep industrial foundation that takes decades to build. And the proof is in numbers that are almost impossible to look away from. Manufacturing as a percentage of India's economy didn't rise to the targeted 25%. It fell from 15.4% down to 14.3%. Of the $23 billion promised in subsidies, only $1.73 billion, barely 8 cents of every dollar, was ever actually paid out. More than 2,000 companies that had officially signed agreements either scaled back dramatically or left India entirely. Employment in manufacturing dropped by over 15 million workers since 2020. 15 million people gone. And foreign investors, the ones who had been pouring money into India on the strength of this story, started pulling out at a pace of $420 million every single day. But here's the twist that nobody predicted. The money didn't just leave India. Much of it went straight back to China, the very country India was supposed to replace. How does something like this happen? How does a $23 billion program, backed by one of the world's largest governments, with full support from the United States and major global corporations, end up strengthening the competitor it was designed to defeat? That's exactly what we're going to unpack today. And I promise you, by the end of this video, the way you think about manufacturing, economic development, and the future of global trade will never quite be the same. Part 1. The dream that seemed inevitable. To understand why this failure stings so deeply, you need to understand how believable the dream was. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power in 2014, he arrived with a clear diagnosis of India's economic problem. The country had built a genuinely impressive services sector: software, IT outsourcing, financial services. Companies like Infosys and Wipro were competing at the global frontier. Indian engineers were writing code for Silicon Valley. The country had a legitimate, growing middle class. But services alone couldn't absorb India's most urgent challenge. Hundreds of millions of young people entering the workforce every year, most of them without university degrees, living in rural areas, needing factory jobs, not coding jobs. For that, India needed to manufacture things, physical goods, at scale. The kind of industrial base that had transformed South Korea from a war-ravaged nation to a global economic force in a single generation. The kind China had built to lift 800 million people out of poverty. Modi's Make in India campaign became the centerpiece of this vision. The stated targets were bold: grow manufacturing from 15% of GDP to 25%. Create 100 million new jobs. Become a genuine global production hub. The logic was entirely defensible. China had done it starting from a position of genuine poverty and technological backwardness in the late 1970s. Why couldn't India? Then came the geopolitical moment that seemed to make the dream not just possible, but inevitable. Donald Trump's trade war with China starting in 2018 sent shockwaves through global supply chains. American companies, suddenly paying heavy tariffs on Chinese goods, urgently needed manufacturing alternatives. And Washington began actively promoting India as the solution, a democratic, English-speaking, populous ally that could serve as a counterweight to Beijing. Replace made in China with made in India became something close to U.S. foreign policy. Corporate America responded. Apple began producing iPhones in India. Elon Musk flew to New Delhi to meet Modi about Tesla factories. Foxconn, the Taiwanese giant that manufactures most of the world's electronics, announced major Indian investments. The headlines were dazzling. The Economist declared India's industrial moment had arrived. The Wall Street Journal tracked supply chains already beginning to shift. By 2021, the Modi government put $23 billion behind the vision. The PLI program offered direct cash incentives to companies that met production targets across sectors from electronics to pharmaceuticals, textiles to solar panels, automobiles to aviation components. Within months, 750 companies had signed up. Indian conglomerates committed billions. Global media called it the beginning of a new industrial age. For one brief window, it looked inevitable. It wasn't. Part 2. The collapse nobody saw coming until they did. The first cracks appeared quietly. 18 months in, industry insiders were whispering about missed targets and delayed payments. Nobody wanted to say it publicly. The political climate around Modi's flagship program wasn't exactly welcoming of criticism. By 2024, the whispers had become an avalanche. Data released in October of that year revealed the scale of the problem. Participating companies had achieved just 37% of their committed production targets. Only 8% of the promised subsidies had been paid. And here's the detail that reveals the deepest contradiction at the heart of the program. Of all the subsidies that were distributed, 94% went to just two sectors, pharmaceuticals and mobile phone assembly. And those two sectors? They happen to be the most thoroughly dependent on Chinese raw materials and components of any industry in India. Think about what that means for a moment. The program designed to reduce China's dominance ended up channeling government money into sectors that were essentially Chinese supply chains with Indian finishing touches. Take pharmaceuticals. India is genuinely, legitimately called the pharmacy of the world. It produces enormous volumes of generic medicines. PLI subsidies helped expand that production. Genuine success, right? Except roughly 70% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the actual chemical compounds that make medicines work, still come from China. Sun Pharmaceutical, one of India's largest drug makers and a major PLI beneficiary, sources approximately 80% of its raw chemical materials from Chinese suppliers. What the Indian government was effectively doing was subsidizing the packaging of Chinese chemicals. The money flowed from New Delhi's treasury through Indian factory floors and landed back in Chinese supplier accounts. The opposite of what was intended. The electronics story is even more instructive. India genuinely became the world's second largest smartphone manufacturer by volume during the PLI period, assembling over 300 million phones a year. The government cited this constantly as proof the program was working. But look at where the actual value in those phones was created. Roughly 80% of smartphone components, processors, memory chips, displays, batteries, cameras, were imported overwhelmingly from China. Indian factories were doing final assembly and packaging. The sophisticated manufacturing, the semiconductor fabrication, the display engineering, the battery chemistry, stayed in East Asia. India was capturing maybe 15 to 20 cents of every dollar of value in the supply chain. China was capturing the rest. This wasn't a secret. Industry analysts understood it clearly. But it was politically inconvenient to say out loud because the headline number, 300 million phones assembled in India, sounded like success. It was only when you looked underneath that the picture changed. Solar energy, automotive, steel. Every major sector told a version of the same story. Every ambitious target ran into the same wall. China had spent 40 years building the deep supply chain infrastructure, processing capacity, and manufacturing ecosystem that makes these industries function. India had spent 5 years offering cash incentives. Cash incentives are not a substitute for 40 years of industrial development, and the PLI program discovered this the hard way. Part 3. The paradox that made everything worse. Here's the part of this story that is almost darkly comic, if the consequences weren't so serious. To reduce dependence on China, India needed Chinese technology and Chinese engineers, modern manufacturing equipment, the robotic assembly lines, precision calibration tools, automated testing systems that run advanced factories, is overwhelmingly made in China. And making that equipment work requires Chinese technicians for installation, calibration, maintenance, and repair. So what did India do, starting in 2020? It reduced visas issued to Chinese citizens by 99%. Read that again. From roughly 200,000 annual visas down to approximately 2,000. The policy was driven by genuine security concerns following deadly military clashes on the Himalayan border. Politically, it was understandable. For manufacturing, it was a disaster. Billions of dollars worth of imported Chinese machinery sat crated and uninstalled in Indian factories because the engineers needed to set it up couldn't get into the country. Assembly lines stood idle. Equipment broke down and stayed broken for months because repair technicians were denied visas. Industry associations calculated that visa restrictions directly caused over $15 billion in production losses and delays. Companies found themselves in a situation almost too absurd to believe. The government was offering subsidies to encourage investment, while simultaneously making it legally impossible to make that investment operational. Foxconn, the world's largest electronics manufacturer, which had pledged $1 billion to Indian expansion, quietly shelved much of that investment. Production lines sat at roughly 30% of originally planned capacity. The company maintained its public commitment to India while privately redirecting investment to Vietnam and Mexico. The most dramatic illustration of India's dilemma was the Vedanta-Foxconn semiconductor project. In 2022, this joint venture announced a $19.5 billion plan to build India's first major chip fabrication plant in Gujarat. The announcement was enormous. Semiconductors are the single most strategically important industrial product in the modern economy. An Indian chip fab would have been genuinely transformative. By 2023, Foxconn had withdrawn from the project entirely. The official reason given was a technology transfer disagreement. But analysts pointed to something more fundamental. Building a semiconductor fabrication facility doesn't just require a factory building. It requires ultra-pure water infrastructure, perfectly stable power delivery, a deep ecosystem of specialized chemical and material suppliers, and a workforce with extremely specialized skills, all of which take decades to develop. India had none of it. No subsidy was large enough to fill that gap on any timeline that made business sense. Meanwhile, as all of this was unfolding, India's trade deficit with China grew to $85 billion in 2024. Bilateral trade reached $118.4 billion. China had not been displaced as India's largest trading partner. It had actually consolidated that position during the very years the PLI program was supposed to be weakening it. Part 4. The bureaucratic nightmare that ate the program alive. There is one more layer to this story, and honestly, it might be the most maddening of all. Even companies that wanted to make the PLI program work, that had the capital, the technology, and the genuine commitment, were defeated by India's institutional machinery. Getting approved for subsidies required 7 categories of documentation and an average wait of 12 to 18 months. In the electronics industry, where product cycles can be as short as 2 years, An 18-month approval process doesn't just create inconvenience. It makes the subsidy economically meaningless before it ever arrives. Over 60% of companies that started the application process abandoned it before completion. And approval was only the beginning. Actually receiving payment required companies to hit targets, compile proof, wait for government verification, wait for budget allocation, and then wait for the fund transfer. Another 12 months, often longer. Companies were making massive upfront investments, factory construction, equipment, workforce, and waiting 2 to 3 years to see the subsidies that justified those investments. Many couldn't survive the cash gap. The experiences of individual companies read like cautionary tales. Tesla's proposed Indian factory required sign-offs from 48 different government departments, each with its own rules, timelines, and occasionally contradictory requirements. Apple invested heavily in Indian iPhone production through its contractor Wistron, applied for subsidies in early 2022, and received, 18 months later, not a payment, but a $320 million tax notice questioning how it had allocated profits between its Indian subsidiary and its global parent. Samsung, one of India's largest foreign investors with manufacturing facilities across multiple states, received a $600 million penalty for alleged tariff violations in 2024. The fine wiped out roughly half a year of profit from Indian operations. 7 Samsung executives were personally fined $81 million. A Samsung executive, speaking anonymously, said it plainly. "We came to India to manufacture products. Instead, we've spent years manufacturing legal defenses." That one line captures something essential about why the program collapsed. Companies weren't fighting the market. They weren't being outcompeted by better rivals. They were being defeated by the system that was supposed to be supporting them. Part 5. The verdict the money delivered. When words fail, watch where the money goes. Between October 2024 and March 2025, approximately $16 billion in foreign investment exited Indian equity markets. On the worst individual days, foreign investors were selling over $400 million in Indian stocks in a single trading session. The Indian rupee weakened. The central bank spent tens of billions in foreign reserves trying to stabilize it. Financial publications that had spent years writing optimistic India analysis began running headlines like "The India Story Reconsidered." And the capital that left India? A significant portion flowed directly into Chinese markets. Foreign investment in Chinese equities surged 42% in the same period that $16 billion abandoned India. Think about what that tells you. Years of geopolitical pressure to decouple from China, trade wars, political declarations, corporate announcements, billions in subsidies, all of it. And when global investors were forced to make real decisions with real money, they chose China. Not because they love China's political system, not because they're indifferent to geopolitics, but because China's infrastructure functions. Its logistics are reliable. Its supply chains are deep, its workforce is trained, its regulatory environment, whatever its political complications, is at least predictable. Predictability, it turns out, is worth more to investors than ambition. Closing, what this story actually teaches us. Let's be honest about what this story is really telling us. It's not a story about one government's policy mistakes, though those mistakes are real. It's not a story about India being incapable, because India has demonstrated genuine capability in many domains. It's a story about time, about the difference between announcing industrial ambition and building the conditions that make industry possible. China's manufacturing dominance didn't come from a 5-year subsidy program. It came from 40 years of continuous patient investment in roads, in ports, in power grids, in vocational training systems, in supply chain development, in institutional capacity. Layer by layer, decade by decade, China built something that couldn't be replicated simply because another country decided to offer cash incentives. Germany's industrial precision, built on an apprenticeship system refined over more than a century. South Korea's electronics giants, the result of generational investment and industrial policy that stretched across multiple political eras. India attempted to compress that timeline into 5 years, and discovered what every nation that has tried this before has eventually discovered. Industrial ecosystems don't respond to shortcuts. India's story is not over. Its demographic advantages are real. Its service sector is world-class. Its consumer market is enormous and growing. The foundation for industrial development exists, but building on that foundation requires the kind of patient, unglamorous, decade-spanning work that rarely generates exciting press conferences. The window that geopolitics opened for India has not permanently closed. But windows don't stay open forever. Vietnam is capturing electronics manufacturing. Bangladesh is absorbing textiles. Mexico is pulling automotive investment. Every year that India's structural problems remain unaddressed is a year that competitors grow stronger. The PLI program failed, but the failure carries within it an education that no successful program ever could. The question now is whether India will learn from it, or simply rebrand the program and repeat the cycle, because the rest of the world is watching, and the verdict that $16 billion in departing capital delivered is one that no press release can rewrite. In manufacturing, as in everything that matters, the gap between saying and doing is where the real story always lives. If this video gave you something to think about, do one simple thing. Share it with someone who needs to understand how global economics really works beneath the surface of the headlines. We spend so much time following the announcements, the signing ceremonies, the bold targets. What we rarely see is what happens after: the quiet retreats, the missed numbers, the honest reckonings. That's what this channel is here for. The story underneath the story. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell, because the next video goes even deeper, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. See you there.